For 2 straight years, the old shepherd mix had slept every single night on the left side of the bed. Frank's side, his gray muzzle resting on Frank's pillow, his body curled into the exact shape of a man who was no longer there. Margaret had tried, more than once, to coax him away. She had patted the empty middle of the mattress. She had brought his favorite blanket to the foot of the bed. Colonel had looked at her with those dark, patient eyes, and then walked right back to Frank's pillow and lay down like it was the only place in the world that made sense. So on the night everything changed, when Margaret woke up at 2 a.m. and reached out of habit for the warm weight that was always there, and found nothing. Her heart dropped straight through the floor. She sat up in the dark, breath caught in her throat, and called his name. Colonel didn't come running the way he always did. She found him at the foot of the bed instead, curled into a tight, quiet ball, not sick, not hurt, just different. Like something inside him had shifted in the night. Margaret sat there in the darkness of the room she used to share with her husband of 31 years, staring at her dog in a spot he had never once chosen in 2 long years, and she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. The cold, certain feeling that her whole world was about to change again, whether she was ready or not. If your dog, or your cat, or your horse suddenly changed the way they acted toward you, would you notice? Would you understand what they were trying to tell you before you were even ready to hear it? Margaret Ellison was 63 years old, and she had spent the last 2 years of her life learning how to breathe again. Not the big, easy kind of breathing people take for granted, the kind you don't even think about, but the deliberate, painful kind, where you have to remind your own lungs that there's still a reason to keep going. Frank had been gone 2 years, 3 months, and 11 days. She knew the number exactly because grief does that to a person. It turns you into an accountant of loss, counting days the way you used to count blessings. Their house sat at the end of Maple Hollow Road in a small town in Ohio, a modest brick 2-story with a wraparound porch that Frank had built with his own 2 hands the summer after they got married. He used to say that porch was the best decision he ever made, right after marrying her. Every evening for 31 years, they had sat out there together, watching the sun drop behind the tree line. Frank with his coffee, Margaret with her tea, not always talking, just being there. Since he passed, Margaret still sat on that porch most evenings. But now it was just her and Colonel curled at her feet, and the terrible, hollow quiet where Frank's voice used to be. People kept telling her time would heal it. She had started to believe they were wrong. Some wounds, she thought, don't heal, you just learn to carry them differently. And carrying that weight alone, night after night, in a house built for 2, had worn a groove into her heart that she was starting to think would never smooth out. Colonel had come into their lives 7 years before Frank passed. A scruffy, half-starved shepherd mix that Frank found wandering along the county road one October morning, ribs showing, one ear torn, looking at Frank like he'd been waiting his whole life for someone to finally stop their truck. Frank always had a soft spot for lost things. He brought the dog home in the bed of his pickup, wrapped in an old flannel shirt, and told Margaret, before she could even protest, "He picked me, Margie." I didn't pick him. That was Frank all over, a man who believed animals chose their people, not the other way around. They named him Colonel because of the way he carried himself once he'd had a few good meals in him, head high, shoulders back, patrolling the fence line of their property like he was inspecting troops. Frank used to laugh and salute him every morning on the way out to the barn. Colonel became Frank's shadow. He rode in the passenger seat of that old pickup with his head out the window. He lay under the workbench in the garage while Frank tinkered with engines that didn't need fixing, just because Frank liked tinkering. And every single night, without fail, Colonel slept pressed against Frank's legs, like he was standing guard even in sleep. Margaret used to tease her husband that he loved that dog more than her. Frank would just grin that crooked grin of his and say, "Now, Margie, there's room in my heart for both my girls." Colonel wasn't just a pet in that house. He was family. He was the third heartbeat in a home that had never needed anyone else. The bond between Frank and Colonel only deepened in Frank's last 2 years after the diagnosis came. Pancreatic cancer, the doctor said, in that flat, careful voice doctors use when they're about to break your whole world in half. Frank was 70 years old and stubborn as a mule, and for a while he tried to keep living exactly like he always had. Chores, coffee on the porch, evening walks down to the pond with Colonel trotting at his heel. But cancer doesn't care how stubborn you are. It took his strength first, then his appetite, then, slowly, painfully, it took the rest. And through every single stage of it, Colonel never left his side. When Frank got too weak to walk to the barn, Colonel stopped going too, choosing instead to lie beside the recliner where Frank spent his days. When the hospice bed was moved into the living room in those final weeks, Colonel found a spot right beside it and refused to budge, not for meals, not for walks, not even when Margaret gently tried to move him so the nurses could work. He would just look up at her with those steady brown eyes and settle back down, as if to say, "I'm not going anywhere, and neither is he, not yet." On the night Frank finally passed, quietly, in his sleep, with Margaret's hand in his, Colonel had been lying pressed against the side of that hospice bed, his head resting on Frank's arm. Margaret would never forget the sound the dog made in the hour after. Not quite a whine, not quite a howl, something low and broken that came from somewhere deep in his chest, a sound she felt in her own bones because it matched exactly what she couldn't say out loud herself. After the funeral, after the casseroles stopped coming, and the sympathy cards stopped arriving, and the house finally emptied of well-meaning relatives, Margaret was left with silence and a dog who understood loss the same way she did. That first night alone, she had climbed into their bed, the one Frank built the frame for, the one with the quilt her mother had sewn, and she had lain there rigid with grief, unable to close her eyes. And then she'd felt it, the mattress shifting, the familiar weight settling in on Frank's side. Colonel had climbed up, walked in a slow circle the way he always did, and lay down exactly where Frank used to sleep, his head resting on Frank's pillow. Margaret had cried harder that night than she had at the funeral, but underneath the grief was something else too. Relief, gratitude, the tiniest flicker of comfort. Because in that moment, it didn't feel like Frank's side of the bed was empty. It felt like something of him was still there, guarding it, keeping it warm, refusing to let it go cold. From that night forward, Colonel claimed that spot every single evening. It became a ritual neither of them ever spoke about, but both of them needed. Margaret would turn off the lamp, and Colonel would climb up, circle twice, and settle onto Frank's pillow with a heavy sigh, and only then would Margaret feel safe enough to close her eyes. That ritual held steady for 2 full years. Through the first unbearable Christmas without Frank, through Margaret's 62nd birthday spent alone at the kitchen table, through the anniversary of their wedding day that she almost couldn't get out of bed for. Colonel was there every night, right on Frank's pillow, a living, breathing piece of continuity in a life that had otherwise been shattered. Margaret built her days around that dog without even realizing it. She woke because he needed to go out. She ate because he sat by his bowl and stared at her with such patient hope that she couldn't disappoint him. She walked the property line every afternoon because Colonel still patrolled it like Frank had trained him to, and she followed along just to have somewhere to put her feet. In a strange, quiet way, Colonel had become her reason to keep functioning when functioning felt impossible. Friends worried about her isolation. Her daughter Ellen called from Columbus every Sunday, gently suggesting grief counseling or a senior center, or maybe even, someday, dating again. Margaret always waved the suggestions away with the same tired joke. "I've got Colonel," she'd say. "He's all the company I need." and for 2 years she genuinely believed that was true. Jim Whitfield lived 3 houses down on Maple Hollow Road, in the little ranch house with the blue shutters that had belonged to his late wife's family. He was 66, a retired high school shop teacher, widowed himself for almost 4 years after losing his wife Carol to a stroke that took her far too fast and far too young. Jim and Frank had known each other for decades, the easy, comfortable kind of friendship that men build over borrowed tools and shared fence lines and long afternoons, fixing things that didn't really need fixing, just for the company of it. After Frank passed, Jim had been one of the many neighbors who showed up with a casserole and a quiet, "Let me know if you need anything, Margie." But unlike most of the others, Jim actually meant it. He mowed a strip of Margaret's yard whenever he did his own, claiming his mower just drifted over the property line. He fixed the loose porch step Frank never got around to before he passed, doing it early one Saturday morning without being asked, leaving only a note that said that step was a hazard. Fixed it. He never lingered, he never pushed. He was just there, in small, steady, undemanding ways, the way good neighbors are, and Margaret had grown fond of him, the way you grow fond of anything reliable in a life that has taught you nothing is guaranteed. For most of those 2 years, that was all it was, quiet neighborly kindness between 2 people who understood each other's grief without needing to discuss it. But somewhere in the back of Margaret's mind, in a place she didn't let herself look at too closely, there was something more starting to take root. She noticed things she felt guilty for noticing. The way Jim's laugh carried across the yard when he was talking to her over the fence. The way he remembered small details, that she took her coffee with cream but no sugar, that Tuesdays were hard for her because that had been Frank's chemo day. She noticed, and then she scolded herself for noticing, and she buried the feeling as fast as it surfaced, because it felt like a betrayal. 31 years of marriage doesn't just fade because someone brings you casseroles and fixes your porch step. Frank had been the great love of her life. The idea of loving anyone else felt, to Margaret, like erasing him, like admitting he was replaceable, and she would rather have stayed lonely forever than do that to his memory. So she kept Jim at a careful, polite distance, close enough to be grateful, far enough to be safe. And every night, Colonel slept on Frank's pillow, and that felt, in some strange way, like proof that she was staying loyal, that some part of the house, some part of her, still belonged only to her husband. Then came the night Colonel moved. It started small, the way most turning points do, disguised as nothing at all. It was a Tuesday in late September, and Margaret had spent the evening on the porch with Jim, who had knocked on her door that afternoon asking if she wanted help clearing out the gutters before the fall storms hit. She hadn't asked him to stay for dinner. It had just happened, the 2 of them falling into an easy conversation over sandwiches and iced tea, laughing. Actually laughing, a real laugh that surprised her coming out of her own mouth, about a story from Jim's shop teacher days involving a student and an unfortunate table saw incident. For nearly 2 hours, Margaret forgot to feel guilty. She forgot to count the days since Frank died. She just sat on that porch in the golden light of a September evening and felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, like a person instead of a widow. When Jim finally left, walking back down Maple Hollow Road with his hands in his pockets and a small smile on his face, Margaret stood on the porch and watched him go, and something in her chest ached in a way that felt almost like hope. She hated herself a little for it. She loved it a little too, and that confusion followed her all the way up the stairs and into bed that night. She turned off the lamp the way she always did. She waited for Colonel to climb up, circle twice, and settle onto Frank's pillow, the ritual that had anchored 2 years of impossible nights. But instead, Colonel walked to the foot of the bed. He turned in his circle there instead, in the spot he had never once chosen, not in 7 years of life, not in 2 years of grief. He lay down, curled tight, and let out a long breath through his nose, and looked up at Margaret in the dim light with an expression she couldn't name. Margaret lay frozen, staring at the empty pillow beside her for the first time in 2 years, feeling the cold shock of it settle into her chest like ice water. "Colonel," she whispered, patting Frank's pillow the way she used to do to draw him up there. "Come on, boy. Come here." Colonel didn't move. He just watched her, his tail giving one small, uncertain thump against the quilt, and stayed exactly where he was. Margaret felt tears sting her eyes, sudden and confusing, grief and something else tangled together so tightly she couldn't pull them apart. It felt like losing Frank all over again, like the last physical thread connecting her to him had just, without warning, let go. She didn't sleep much that night. She lay in the dark replaying the evening on the porch, replaying Jim's laugh, replaying the ease of it, and then replaying the sight of Colonel curled at the foot of the bed instead of on Frank's pillow. And her mind kept circling back to one terrible, guilty thought. What if the dog knew something about her own heart before she was willing to admit it to herself? What if this wasn't random at all? Margaret had never been a superstitious woman. She believed in hard work, in casseroles for grieving neighbors, in Sunday church when her knees weren't too bad to kneel. But lying there in the dark next to an empty pillow for the first time in 2 years, she found herself wondering if there was something bigger at work. If maybe some things happen not by accident, but because something, or someone, is trying to tell you it's time. The days after that were harder than Margaret expected. It wasn't just one strange night. Colonel kept sleeping at the foot of the bed, every single night after that, as if some switch had permanently flipped. And with it came a wave of grief Margaret hadn't braced herself for, a grief she thought she'd already survived. She had grieved Frank's death. She hadn't prepared herself to grieve this too, this small, quiet, four-legged proof that some final chapter of her marriage had closed. She found herself standing in the doorway of the bedroom some mornings, just looking at that empty pillow, feeling a hollow ache she couldn't explain to anyone, not even Ellen, who called on Sunday and immediately noticed something was wrong in her mother's voice. "Mom, what happened?" Ellen asked. Margaret tried to explain it. The dog, the pillow, the sudden absence of a 2-year ritual, and even as she said it out loud, she realized how strange it sounded, how impossible it was to make someone understand the true weight of a dog changing where he slept, unless you had lived inside that grief the way she had. Ellen, gently, carefully, asked the question Margaret had been avoiding. "Mom, do you think it has anything to do with Jim?" Margaret didn't answer for a long time. The silence said more than she wanted it to. The week that followed felt like walking through fog. Margaret avoided her own bedroom as long as she could each night, staying up later than usual, finding reasons to sit on the porch even after the September air turned cool enough to need a sweater. She told herself she wasn't avoiding anything. She told herself the dog's behavior meant nothing, that animals shift their habits for 100 small reasons that have nothing to do with grief or love or moving on. But underneath the excuses, she knew better. Colonel had never once, in 2 years, chosen anywhere but Frank's pillow, not during thunderstorms, not on the hardest anniversaries, not on the nights Margaret cried herself to sleep so hard the whole bed shook. If he was choosing differently now, it wasn't random. Some part of her believed dogs feel things people spend a lifetime trying to talk themselves out of. And some part of her was terrified of what that meant. She was feeling too. It was during that same difficult week that Jim knocked on her door holding a pie. Margaret opened the door already knowing something was different, because Jim never knocked like that. 3 careful, deliberate raps, none of his usual easy 2-knuckle tap. And when she saw his face, she nearly laughed, despite everything weighing on her heart, because Jim Whitfield, a man who had survived 32 years of teaching teenagers how to operate power tools without losing a finger, looked more nervous standing on her porch holding an apple pie than she had ever seen a grown man look in her life. His hands were shaking slightly. He'd worn a collared shirt, buttoned all the way up, the kind of shirt a man wears when he's trying to say something matters. "Margie," he said, and then stopped, cleared his throat, started again. "I made this pie." "Well, Carol's recipe. I never really made it myself before, so it might not be right." He held it out like an offering, like evidence of something he didn't quite have the words for yet. Margaret took the pie with hands that weren't entirely steady either, and for a moment the two of them just stood there on the porch, two grieving people who had built careful, polite distances around themselves for years, both suddenly aware that the ground beneath them had shifted. "Can I come in?" Jim asked. "There's something I want to say, and I think I'll lose my nerve if I have to say it standing out here." Margaret's heart pounded as she stepped aside to let him in. Colonel, who had been lying by the fireplace, lifted his head as Jim walked past, and instead of the low, watchful growl he usually gave strangers approaching too close to Margaret, he simply thumped his tail against the floor and settled back down, unbothered, almost welcoming. Margaret noticed that too. She noticed everything that week, every small signal she used to be able to ignore. They sat at the kitchen table, the pie between them, untouched. Jim laced his fingers together and unlaced them again, a nervous habit Margaret had never seen from him before. "I've been trying to figure out how to say this for a long time," he began, his voice lower than usual, rougher around the edges, longer than I probably should admit. "I loved Carol, 38 years, and I loved every one of them, and losing her nearly broke me in half. I never thought I'd feel anything again, not like what I've started feeling for you, Margie, and I want you to know I'm not trying to replace Frank. I'd never do that. He was a good man, my friend, and nothing that happens between us could ever erase what you two had. But I've watched you these past 2 years. I've watched you carry more weight than one person should have to carry alone, and every single time I'm near you, I feel something I thought I'd buried with Carol. I don't know what to do with that feeling except tell you the truth. I care about you, Margaret. More than a neighbor should. And I've been terrified to say it because I didn't want to lose what we already have if you didn't feel the same." Margaret sat in the quiet kitchen, the late afternoon light slanting gold across the table, and felt something crack open in her chest, not breaking, but breaking loose, like a door finally swinging open after being wedged shut for years. She thought about Frank, about 31 years of marriage, about the ache that had never once fully faded and probably never would. She thought about Colonel on Frank's pillow for 2 straight years, and Colonel at the foot of the bed this past week, and the strange, undeniable feeling that her old dog somehow understood something about her heart before she'd let herself understand it. And she thought about how alive she'd felt on that porch a week ago, laughing over sandwiches, forgetting to count her grief for 2 whole hours. She reached across the table and put her hand over Jim's, stilling his nervous fingers. "I feel it too," she said quietly. "I've felt it for a while now. I just didn't think I was allowed to." The weeks that followed weren't simple. Grief and new love don't sit comfortably in the same heart without some friction, and Margaret found herself wrestling with guilt more nights than she expected. There were evenings she'd catch herself laughing with Jim on the porch and suddenly feel a stab of shame so sharp it stole her breath, as if Frank could somehow see her and was disappointed. She went to his grave one gray October afternoon, sat on the cool grass beside the headstone, and told him everything. About Jim, about the pie, about Colonel and the pillow, about how scared she was of loving someone new without it meaning she loved Frank any less. She sat there a long time, the wind moving through the maple trees overhead, and when she finally stood to leave, she felt lighter, like some permission she'd been waiting for had quietly been granted. Whether it came from Frank, from God, from her own healing heart, finally catching up to what her body already knew, she couldn't say for certain. But she felt it all the same, and it steadied her enough to keep walking forward instead of standing frozen at the edge of something new. Jim, for his part, was patient in a way that Margaret hadn't known she needed. He never pushed for more than she could give. He never made her feel like she owed him her grief on any particular timeline. Some nights they simply sat together on the porch in comfortable silence, Colonel stretched out between their chairs, and that was enough. Other nights, Jim would tell her stories about Carol, and Margaret would tell him stories about Frank, and somehow, instead of feeling like betrayal, it felt like honoring both the people they'd lost by refusing to pretend those 30-plus years hadn't mattered. They were building something new out of two lives that had already been fully lived and fully loved once before, and there was a particular, hard-won tenderness in that, the kind that only comes from two people who know exactly how precious and how fragile love is, because they've both already survived losing it. Colonel never went back to Frank's pillow. Not once, not even on nights Jim wasn't there. He stayed at the foot of the bed, faithfully, every single night, as though his job had changed, as though for 2 years his job had been to hold Frank's place, to keep that side of the bed from feeling so unbearably empty, and now that job was finished. Now, it seemed, his job was simply to be near Margaret, wherever she was, watching over her the way he'd always watched over Frank. Margaret found herself thinking, more than once, about something her grandmother used to say, that God sometimes speaks to us through the animals because we trust them in ways we don't always trust ourselves. She wasn't sure if she fully believed it, but she believed enough now to think that maybe Colonel had understood something before she did, that grief has a season, and love has a season, and sometimes the hardest, holiest thing a person can do is let one season end so another can quietly begin. The turning point that finally, truly cemented things came on a cold evening in late November, almost exactly 2 years and 4 months after Frank passed. Jim had asked Margaret to dinner at his house, nothing fancy, just something he'd cooked himself. And afterward, sitting by his fireplace with Colonel curled at their feet, Jim had turned to her with a seriousness in his eyes that made her chest tighten. "I'm not asking you to marry me tonight," he said, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I know it's too soon for that, and honestly, I'm scared enough just saying what I'm about to say. But I want you to know, I'm not going anywhere, Margie. Whatever this is, however slow it needs to go, I'm in it. I lost one great love. I never thought I'd find a second one. I'm not about to let it slip through my hands because I was too cautious to say so." Margaret felt tears well up, the good kind this time, the kind that come from being seen fully and loved anyway. She thought about how impossible this moment would have seemed 2 years ago, sitting alone in that too-quiet bedroom, certain her life of love was already over. And she thought about Colonel, about the strange, quiet wisdom of an old dog who somehow always seemed to know what she needed before she did. There was a moment, walking home from Jim's that night under a sky thick with November stars, Colonel trotting steadily at her side the way he used to trot at Frank's, when Margaret stopped in the middle of the road and just breathed. The cold air filled her lungs, sharp and clean, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, breathing didn't feel like an effort. It felt easy. It felt like something she didn't have to force herself to remember to do. She looked down at Colonel, at his gray muzzle catching the moonlight, at the dog who had guarded her husband through sickness and death, who had guarded her through 2 years of grief so heavy it nearly buried her, who had somehow known, before anyone else, including herself, that it was finally time to let someone else in. "You knew, didn't you?" she said softly, and Colonel looked up at her, tail wagging slow and steady, as if to say he'd known all along. Spring came, as it always does, even after the hardest winters. Margaret and Jim didn't rush anything. No sudden wedding, no dramatic announcement to the neighborhood. Instead, their life together grew the way real love does when it's built by people old enough to know better than to hurry it. Slowly, steadily, rooted in patience and honesty and the shared understanding that some of the best love stories are the quiet ones, built not on fireworks but on casseroles and fixed porch steps and a dog who moved from one pillow to the foot of the bed, and, eventually, without anyone quite noticing when it happened, started splitting his nights evenly between both their houses. By the time the maple trees along the hollow turned green again, Jim had become such a steady presence in Margaret's life that Ellen stopped asking careful questions on their Sunday calls and started simply asking how Jim was doing, the way you ask about family. Margaret still sat on her porch most evenings. But now, more often than not, Jim sat beside her, and Colonel lay stretched across both their feet, and the silence that used to feel so unbearably empty had become something else entirely. Full, warm, alive with two lives, quietly rebuilding themselves out of loss. Margaret kept Frank's memory close through all of it. She never took down their wedding photo from the hallway wall. She still visited his grave every month, still told him things, still felt him, in some quiet way, present in the corners of the life she was building. She came to believe, over time, that loving Jim didn't erase any of that. If anything, it deepened her understanding of what Frank had given her. 31 years of proof that love was worth the risk, worth the eventual grief, worth everything it cost. Frank had taught her how to love fully, and in his own strange, quiet way, so had Colonel, standing guard over that pillow for 2 long years, until the exact moment Margaret was ready to move forward, and then stepping aside, without hesitation, the instant he sensed she didn't need him to hold that place anymore. She thought, often, about that first terrible night Colonel had moved to the foot of the bed, about how much it had felt like losing Frank all over again. Now, looking back, she understood it differently. It hadn't been an ending. It had been an opening, a door swinging quietly wide, right at the exact moment she needed it to, guided by something wiser than her own frightened heart could manage on its own. She would never be able to prove, not to her daughter, not to her church friends, not even fully to herself, that Colonel had somehow known what was happening inside her before she did. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe old dogs simply change their habits sometimes, for reasons that have nothing to do with grief or love or timing. But Margaret had lived through enough loss and enough unexpected grace by then to believe that some coincidences aren't really coincidences at all. Some of them are gifts, delivered quietly, on 4 paws, exactly when a broken heart needs them most. By the following autumn, almost exactly a year after Jim had shown up on her porch with that nervous, uneven pie, he asked Margaret to marry him. Not with fireworks or grand gestures, but on that same porch, at sunset, with Colonel lying between their 2 chairs the way he always did. Margaret said yes with tears running freely down her face, and when she looked down at Colonel afterward, he was already on his feet, tail wagging, pressing his gray muzzle against her hand, as if he'd been waiting for this moment just as long as she had. She married Jim the following spring, a small ceremony in the backyard under the same maple trees Frank had once planted, and Colonel walked her down the makeshift aisle, a ribbon tied around his neck, steady and proud, doing his final job as guardian of a story that had asked more of him than anyone could have expected from an old dog with a torn ear and a habit of sleeping on the... Colonel lived 2 more years after that, growing gray around the muzzle, slower on his walks, but never once losing that steady, watchful presence that had carried Margaret through the hardest chapter of her life. When he finally passed, peacefully in his sleep, on a warm July afternoon, Margaret and Jim buried him beneath the maple trees near Frank's favorite spot in the yard, and Margaret knelt there for a long time afterward, hand pressed to the fresh earth, thanking him, for guarding Frank when he was dying, for guarding her when she was grieving, and for knowing, somehow, long before she did, exactly when it was time to let her heart move forward. She has told this story many times since then, to her grandchildren, to new neighbors, to anyone who will listen, because she believes with her whole heart that it matters, that sometimes the animals we love understand our pain and our healing better than we understand it ourselves, and that sometimes God uses the most unexpected, humble creatures to teach us the most important lessons of our lives. If you've ever had a pet who seemed to know exactly what you needed before you did, we would love to hear about it in the comments below. And if you're someone who's ever struggled with the guilt of loving again after losing someone, we want you to know you're not alone, and we'd be honored if you shared your own story with us. If you love these kinds of human and animal bond stories, hit that subscribe button, because every single week we bring you a brand new story just like this one, a story that will touch your heart, remind you what really matters, and maybe, just maybe, help you believe a little more in the quiet, unexplainable ways that love finds its way back into a broken heart. Thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next story.